Welcome to the 2022 Data Summit. You are probably aware of the recent articles that were published in the Hechinger's report, Pew Research, the Chronicle of Higher Education, just to name a few, that have reported the plight of male students in higher education. They reported the plight of them, right? Regardless of the report, you might have read the information from these articles suggests that male students are not as successful as female students on key metrics like graduation, transfer, retention, course pass rates. We also know that male enrollment is also declining, has been declining for a number of years. And the students who were interviewed in these articles basically shared numerous explanations as to why. Some had to do with economics, financial issues, work issues, and whether or not having an education would be of value to them. So ORRE decided that we were going to dig into MC's data and see whether or not our data was consistent with the national trends. So as a prelude to the presentation by our guest speaker today, we will present information on OIR, on Montgomery College students, as well as some data on MCPS, high school students, college scoring rate, some national data, and some statewide information. So we use a variety of sources to pull this information together. Our data warehouse was one. The Maryland Longitudinal Data System Center has a host of information there. The National Center for Educational Statistics is also very useful for grabbing information, as well as the Maryland Higher Education Degree Progress Model that I'll speak to just briefly as we walk through some of this data. Many of our students are Montgomery County residents, so it's befitting to talk a little bit about MCPS students' college going rate. And this is also coming from the Maryland MLDSC. In the fall semester after high school graduation, female students are more likely to enroll in college as first-time, full-time degree-seeking students than male students. You can see the disparity right here on the chart. They're more likely to attend college right after high school as first-time, full-time degree-seeking students. The disparity is very obvious. When you look at the state data, looking at all high schools within the state of Maryland, you can see the same disparity. Females are more likely to go to college right after high school as first-time, full-time degree-seeking than male students will. So we're going to look at our data, Montgomery College's data, from the perspective of the scorecard, arrival, progression, completion, and focus on first-time, what did you call it, ever in college students. There's relative parity in terms of the percentage of male and female students that come to college as first-time, full-time, first-time ever in college students, right? With the exception of 2 years, fall 17, fall 20, sort of flipped. But in general, about 50% of our students are male and female walking in the door as first time ever in college students. Females are slightly older than males, about a year or so. When students walk into our doors, one thing that we do is try to assess them for college readiness, particularly in math and English. So when students come in, we can see here that female students had a higher need for English developmental coursework than males. And they also had a higher percentage in need for math. But when they go through the coursework, females perform better than men in college level gateway English, and there's relative parity for males and females when it comes to college gateway math courses. Female students return at a higher rate than males. They tend to be very persistent, more so than male students are. One of the things we would like for students to do if they're full-time students is to earn 24 hours in the first year, 48 hours by year 2. And part-time students are expected to earn half that, in order for them to move through the educational pipeline in order to achieve their goals. Female students way ahead of men when it comes to credit hour attainment, whether they're full-time or part-time, first year and second year. Females outdo males. Females also perform better in their classes, in their courses. So the overall course pass rate is higher for females than it is for male students. They also have higher GPAs. So we were sort of interested in some of the data that was in the SESI. And one of my team members pulled out a particular question in SESI that sort of gets into the engagement piece. And the question was, how much has your experience at this college contributed to your knowledge, skills, and personal development? In all areas, whether we're talking about career opportunities, getting information about that, clear career goals, solving math problems, being analytical, more critical thinkers, female students had a higher percentage of indicating that they were able to get this from the college than male students were. Again, they are a bit more engaged than male students are. So completion. So we're going to look at degree attainment, graduation transfer rates. One of the ways we assess grad transfer rate here is to look at what is called the degree progress model. It's a statewide measure. All community colleges in the state use it. And that is new students coming into the college, full and part-time, who have earned at least 18 hours within the first 2 years, and then track their progress over 4 years. And what the data shows is that female students graduate and or transfer within 4 years at a higher rate than male students. This one also is looking at, just in general, this is from the National Center for Educational Statistics, is looking at whether or not male and female students actually earn a degree from a community college within 3 years. Female students are more likely to earn that degree within 3 years than male students are. Going back to MCPS students, and this is coming again from MLDS, what they also have shown us is that female students are more likely to earn an award, graduate from college, by the age of 25 than male students are. They progress, earn that degree, move on at a higher rate than male students. And then when you look at different degree attainments, female students, again, are more likely to earn an AA degree, a bachelor's degree, or master's degree than male students are. And here, Nessie put up 2 points in time, 2010 versus 2021. And you can see the larger disparity happening within the last year or so. The 2021 data, there's a wider range there than it was for 2010. So female students are more likely to earn an award. So that's pretty much all I need to say. And this is basically to, lay some foundation for our conversation. So Dr. Williams, our illustrious president, is going to come up here and introduce our guest speaker.
So that was a lot, Dr. Blaylock, in a fantastically stimulating way. You kind of ended on and that's all I have to say, just access and engagement and outcomes and success and these disparities that we see between our male-identified and female-identified students, both at Montgomery College and nationally, and just kind of lay that out there, and that's all I have to say. Just kind of sit down. It's like, so we're not here for any big reason today, but thank you, Dr. Blaylock, for really creating that framework. And I would also like to say greetings to everyone. This is fantastic. I was walking around and seeing everyone, all the smiling faces. Everyone is so engaged to be here, at the 2022 Data Summit, and I'm informed this is the 5th year, and this is awesome. It's always so great to see how we show up, and this is what the Data Summit looks like at Montgomery College. I feel like I'm just like floating throughout the rest of the day. This is a beautiful way to start the day, and I'd be remiss if I didn't thank everyone here. I see our MCTV folks, so thank you all for making this happen in terms of virtual and recording. Really appreciate all of your, all of your efforts. So I just want to share a little bit, and for those of you who I've had an opportunity to talk with, and you probably know that I'm a big fan of data. I don't know if that's a fan of data. I don't know what category that puts me in, but it's true. I share a story that I was part of a professional association at one point in time, and I was the regional representative for the assessment, evaluation, and research knowledge community, the AER knowledge community, so when I was in the Midwest. So it's something that's very near and dear to my heart because I know it's very close to how we can actually impact change. Right? I don't just love it for the sake of loving it, although I was inquisitive as a child and I like information and data. But one of the underpinnings is that we know that analyzing and leveraging and using data in a purposeful way can impact change. Right? It can impact the change that we just saw we need to make in terms of these disparities that Dr. Blaylock just illustrated. And it's not enough to have these numbers, these data. We have to make meaning. Right? And that's what happens with Dr. Blaylock and her team, and I see John Hammond here. So, and all this towards our end goal, right? Why we show up every day, to move forward our mission, right? To help students change their lives, to impact our communities, right? To be accountable for our results, right? This is all part and parcel, and. I'm not going to reiterate anything that you shared. I think that data is extremely clear. What I will share is, and what I will ask is, and it's not rhetorical, but just kind of answer it to yourselves, is what did that make you think of? What did that make you feel, right? What opportunities do you see us having at the college to impact students, to impact the communities that we serve? I think Dr. Blaylock really presented a foundation that also speaks to some of the adjustments that we've made in terms of our Voice of Men program, in terms of presidential scholars, right? Period, or maybe exclamation point, because those are fantastic programs and initiatives. With that said, it seems that there is an opportunity for us to also engage in a holistic conversation, because this is across all race, ethnicities, and so how are we going to approach this disparity and these disparities in a holistic way, right? And I think that is a huge opportunity for us here at Montgomery College, and an opportunity that I know we're willing to embrace, right, to lean into when we think about access and completion and post-completion success, right? When we think about how we leverage education as an opportunity for social transformation. What is this data? how is it driving our actions? And I am here, as you heard a few moments ago, to introduce someone. So all that was just a bunch of ad-libbing. I had notes, but I will quickly transition because it's very exciting, and read a little bit of his book, and I know that we're excited because we have with us someone who's uniquely qualified to continue the conversation that Dr. Blaylock just started with the mounds of data. So Mr. Andrew Reiner he teaches honors at Townsend University, including a seminar on the changing face of masculinity. He is a prolific writer whose material on gender has gained a robust following on social media. He has been published in Washington Post and the New York Times, among other spaces. I just mentioned his book, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. In 2020, he wrote a book called Better Boys, Better Men, The New Masculinity That Creates Greater Courage and Emotional Resiliency. So I know that we're all waiting and hoping and expecting and knowing, because hope's not a plan, that you'll have some insights for us as an institution and how we strive to create better outcomes, right? And I really appreciated the holistic or the approach that you took in terms of, what is actually impacting the outcomes. And I think oftentimes, and far too often in higher education, we look at things in terms of, underperformance or underachievement. And that provides too much of a neural network, if you will, to the onus being on the student or on the individual. And one of the things that I've grown to love and embrace about us here at Montgomery College is we look inward, right? What are the strategies that we're, actually putting forward? What are the policies? What are the procedures? What are the environments that we're creating that lend itself to the outcomes that you just saw Dr. Blaylock put up there? And I appreciated that, the approach that Mr. Reiner is taking is talking about, these factors that are contributing to outcomes, right? And how we can move forward, how we can identify them, how we can address, how we can help to amplify our male-identified individuals so that they're, really optimizing everything that they can offer, and we're working in concert with them. So I will say, without any further ado, I'm super excited about how we can learn how to better serve our male-identified students and all of our students, and we have just an excellent individual who's here with us today. So without any further ado, I would like to invite our guest speaker up and share with us today. So, Mr. Reiner. Thank you for being with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Lance. Thank you all for being here today, taking part in this crucial conversation. Before we get started, just a few quick thank yous. Thank you so much to Brian Alt for his tireless commitment to the conversation about healthy masculinity and about how essential it is to preventing young men from falling through the cracks in higher education. I'm so grateful for your collaboration, Brian, and for bringing this conversation here to Montgomery College. Thank you to Dr. Arlene Blaylock for her part in this 2022 Data Summit. And I want to thank you, I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you to Daphne Alfalor for all of her administrative support and tenacity with getting me here working behind the scenes. So before I begin, I do want to just kind of segue into something that Dr. Williams had said about holistic approach. That is very much what I'll be leaning into today, this idea of a holistic approach. And you'll see what I mean as the talk unfolds, because we really are at a time, we're really kind of at a crucible time in higher education, I would really say in education period, where regardless of gender identity, our students, as well as we, are at a place where mental health is something and well-being is something that we really cannot afford to overlook. We simply cannot afford to overlook. I'll just share with you really quickly a study that I come across when I was doing some research for one of my articles. And it was this longitudinal study which went from post-World War II through the early 2000s. And what it found was that regardless of culture, regardless of race, regardless of anywhere in the world, that when people experience trauma, and it wasn't so much how long it was sustained, it was the depth of the trauma, that it took as much as 9 years to process through and work through that trauma. And so clearly, that speaks volumes about where we are today with the pandemic. This is not something we don't have the luxury anymore of looking beyond what we did a few years ago. Before the pandemic, a lot of us knew, in the abstract, that millennials and Gen Z are the most stressed out, anxious, depressed generations that we have seen. A lot of us could speak anecdotally to that. But now with the pandemic, it's blown open the Pandora's box. And we really do not any longer have the luxury of looking beyond education as anything less than having to really treat, maybe not treat is the right word, but really help the entire student. It really does have to be a shift in the way that we look at the paradigm of educating. For years, I've been noticing a marked difference between my non-honors college students, I also teach in the honors college at Towson, who identify as male, and those who identify as female. And I'm not just talking about, being called professor versus being called dude. My male students start off the semester strong enough. They always do, semester in, semester out. And what happens is that they, like their female peers, they'll raise their hands, they'll participate in class discussions, they'll even hand in assignments on time. And what I've been seeing for a while now is that within a month or so of all these changes, their class attendance becomes more sporadic. They're not handing the assignments as much, if sometimes not even at all, and their involvement in class participation drops off precipitously. It's almost as if some kind of unspoken but understood statute of limitations kicks in with their investment in their academic consistency and what I would call risk-taking. And that's an important part of our conversation today, is what I call healthy risk-taking. It's a term I use a lot in my book. So I've been curious to see if this is a trend that's more universal. And I've started asking students in my upper-level honors college courses, especially the Changing Face of Masculinity, if they've noticed any differences between their peers who are self-identifying as male and female, going back as far as high school as well as during college. And the responses are almost always, semester in, semester out, very similar. The male students typically fall into two camps on their observations. Occasionally, one or two students will screw up the courage and he'll say, yep, I absolutely see a difference between the gender identities and in terms of performance in the classroom. A lot of them, though, grow just simply defensive, and they'll say, you know what, I don't see any difference at all. The female peers, however, very different. They share a perspective that really reverbs in stereo, and this is what they often observe. Compared to girls, young women, excuse me, many young men in high school and even in college don't participate as much in classroom discussions. They don't raise their hands as much. They don't ask as many questions. They don't study as much, and they often will brag to their peers about studying the night before tests and quizzes. They don't put as much effort, and I hear this one a lot on the down low, that they don't put as much effort into group projects as their female peers do. They don't embrace the process or the practice of learning, and they often will act cool and play it off as if they don't care when they earn bad grades. And I have to tell you, these observations from these female students are spot on. One thing that the girls didn't speak to, but that maybe some of us can, is that many boys and young men are out of step with rapidly changing expectations. They aren't equipped with the social emotional skill set that's needed in a world that now starts requiring these skills as early as kindergarten. Without this skill set, many boys and young men aren't as prepared or as relevant in school settings and when they get older in the workplace as well. But it's not just this lack of social emotional skills that so many boys and young men lack. The traditional masculine script that many adults, parents, coaches, even educators still encourage in these unsophisticated boys whose brains haven't fully matured often teaches them in some way, unwittingly, to reject classroom success. Many boys, as Dr. Blaylock pointed out, aren't keeping up with girls. Now, if you pay attention to trends in education and higher education and even in the workforce, then you know that girls and young women are heading up the figurative escalator. Boys and young men are heading down. At best, they're stuck between floors. Because when boys are getting into colleges and universities and the workplace, they aren't keeping pace. In fact, they're stagnating. Here are some topics that we'll be examining today. What I've started calling the great guy slide in numbers, both during college and beyond college. We'll be looking at the contributing factors. Part of it is the wiring, and I'll be getting into that a little bit, the biology of this. An important part of it that we don't talk enough about, and I have a chapter in my book on that I dedicated, is how we talk to and don't talk to boys and the impact of that. Traditional masculine norms, as I mentioned a few moments ago, mental health struggles. And the fact that, and this is something that I know can be a little bit touchy, but for many young men, some of them don't feel that college is really a welcoming place for them. And then I'll offer up some tips at the end, kind of a wrapping it up, ways that we can hopefully try to engage our young male students in some ways. Because really, if we're going to do right by our male students, if we're going to truly prepare them for a rapidly changing world, we really need to become aware of what's holding them back and how we can help them better thrive. And that's what, of course, the conversation is going to be about today. Now, some of you might be thinking, hold on here, Andrew. Neither I nor my colleagues are seeing what you're talking about here at Montgomery College. And sure, some boys might be guilty of a disconnected approach to learning, but many of them are active participants in class and they put in the effort. And if that's true, I'm very glad to hear that, truly. But even if that is the case, we really can't ignore the global trends that are occurring in many Western cultures, and most glaringly here in the United States. And after all, this is a data summit, so sit back and enjoy a little bit of stat crunching here. Many male students are quick to let young women take charge of class discussions and group projects. They're less likely to ask for help. One study found that 33% of girls and young women say they get excited almost every day about something that they've learned in class versus 21% of their male classmates. We know that the going rate in American colleges and universities of student body numbers is pretty much holding steady at 60% female and 40% male. Young women, as Dr. Blaylock was attesting to, are far more likely, once they're in college, to stay there and to graduate than their male cohorts are. And there's something else that really hasn't gotten a lot of discussion in the conversation, something I've been writing about actually for years. I wrote about it in my book. I wrote about it in pieces for the Times and the Post before that, that really it's not just at the college level. Really now what we're seeing is that more young women are entering into graduate schools, law schools and medical schools, and they're actually surpassing males in these areas as well. And please understand that, as we talk about these things, this isn't a tit for tat. This isn't an either or. This conversation is an and. You know, when we bring up these discussions about gender, it's important to remember, it's not competition. It's not the either or the or. It's not the one or the other, it's the and. Because really, you know, if an entire gender is falling through the cracks, how can that not impact everybody? That's a rhetorical question, obviously. You know, I could get into a whole nother conversation about the economics of this as I do in my book. It is a huge repercussion when you've got an entire gender falling through the cracks. This trend continues beyond college. More women than men without college degrees are employed. 13% of college graduate males and 25% of high school graduate males are living at home with their parents. One study from researchers at Princeton, the University of Chicago, and the University of Rochester attributed this to, you're going to love this, better video game technology. I kid you not. I kid you not. They attribute it to better video game technology, finding that men ages 21 to 30, right, that's the upper end of college into adulthood, were working between 38 and 79% less. Young men, even those with college degrees, are far more likely to work at lower level hospitality or service jobs, part-time jobs, or not to work at all. Males ages 25 to 34 with a college degree are twice as likely to be underemployed as their female cohorts are in that age range. And I'm going to say that one again. Males ages 25 to 34 with a college degree are twice as likely to be unemployed as their female cohorts are. Women are far more selective and finicky even about applying to jobs than are men, and this is from a LinkedIn report. They found that when women do apply to a job, they're 16% more likely than men to get hired, and in fact, the role for a more senior position goes up to 18%. When guys are employed, they're more likely to jump from job to job, trying to maximize the income more than anything else, regardless of whether the work is personally fulfilling or not. The women in this study said that income, of course, is important, and the work also, the quality of the work was important to them as well. So we really have to finally acknowledge, what is this pink elephant in the room? You know, what the hell is going on with boys and men that they're not keeping up with girls and young women? Is this a recent trend? Is it biological? Do traditional gender roles play a part? Has the classroom on all levels become more hostile to boys and young men than girls and young women, as some people insist? So let's start out with the role of biology in boys' classroom behavior and approach to learning. So the predominating wisdom is that males, that old book title, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. It's the old argument that the wiring is simply different for men and for women, and that is the main reason that we see so many discrepancies now. But our differences aren't as planetary as we might think. So first, let's talk about the brains. As I discovered in my research for Better Boys, Better Men, over the past 6 years, many neuroscientists have been dispelling the old myth that there is a male brain and there's a female brain. Newer research indicates that the human brain isn't binary in its gender makeup at all. In fact, it's what they call a mosaic of both traditionally male and female features and structures. There was a groundbreaking study conducted by Israeli neuroscientists, and they examined 1,400 brain imaging scans. They found that 8% of the brain study portrayed typically male or female features. And this squares with similar research, which has found that approximately, same numbers, 92% of human brains share similar structures and features, regardless of gender identity. These researchers said that there's no way to prove that gendered behavior is biological because brain imaging studies were conducted on adults, not children. These are people, after all, who spent a lifetime conditioned by highly gendered norms. So their ingrained gendered beliefs must be what's driving their expectations about how people identify as male and female and how they're expected to behave and think. Lisa Elliott is another neuroscientist. She wrote a wonderful book called Pink Brain, Blue Brain. And when I interviewed her, she had said, basically she echoed these findings that both men and women share a lot of the same instincts. Gender differences, she said, get larger with age, not because of biology, but because of how much we segregate and how much we socialize in separate gendered spheres. And this is not just men. Women do this as well. And then there's this. We now know about neuroplasticity, right? We know that the human brain is malleable. We can change our neural pathways with hard work, which means that we can potentially alter our behavior, our thoughts, and yes, our worldview. This means that we can rewire gendered thoughts with practice. So all of this said, there is a little bit of biology at play here. One of the things I discovered when I was doing research for my book is that boys' brains are flooded with testosterone at two important stages of their lives. The first is in utero, when the secondary sexual characteristics first develop. And then the second time that the male brains are flooded with testosterone is during puberty. So while this hormone is what helps create and develop sexual characteristics in males, it also delays brain growth. Testosterone stifles development of the brain's right hemisphere, which among other things includes the part of the brain where the amygdala is located, and that's the seat of negative emotion and the ability to think and plan for the future. You probably can see where I'm going with this. And I have to say, just as a side note, when I read this, I thought, given my own life and how late of a bloomer I am, I read this and I thought, thanks a lot, testosterone. Thanks so much. I really did, by the way. When I became aware of this delay in the amygdala, I suddenly began understanding why one of the things I discovered during research for my book and observing classes and talking to teachers at all levels, especially with younger boys, is why so many boys cry more readily in classrooms than girls their age, and why they're so much more reactive as they get older. It made sense why they get so upset, so angry and frustrated when they can't learn a skill or a concept as quickly as everyone else. As a quick side note, I had a fascinating conversation. I was giving talks at some boys' schools in Australia, and this Australian counselor said to me, she said, you really should pay attention to boys when they're learning in the classroom. She said, because what you observe is they are far more quick to get frustrated and visibly upset than a lot of their cohorts are, because they cannot really deal with the big emotions of the frustration. Girls are much better at just kind of calibrating and dealing with it. Not that they're not struggling, but the ways that they deal with the reactivity is far different. And that's important for us to remember, even at the college level as educators. A lot of boys will play it off, and I'll talk more about this in a few minutes. The young men we deal with are great at playing it off. We can't even tell half the time what's going on inside their heads. And that's part of the masculine script at work. That is them putting on their game face. But the struggles are still there, and they're having huge repercussions. If you can put on that game face, but you still can't pull yourself together to stay in school and do the work, there's a giant disparity there that we need to look at. At the high school and college level, of course, as I said, we're not seeing this. So many of our male students wear these countenances that betray insouciance, indifference, and even cocksure confidence. And this is an example of just this masking that so many boys and young men do as a way of feeling that they are betraying their confidence. They are showing their competence as ascending men. What we don't realize is that this masking takes so much emotional and mental energy to create and maintain these masks. And this means that when boys are in a classroom, they're in our classroom, and they're not getting something, and they're not understanding something, and they're more concerned with looking like they've got it all together, they're disconnecting, they're checking out. Because one of the things that is so common for boys and young men is they never want to look like they don't have their act together. They always want to look like they've got everything under control. But what's going on inside of them is that they're checking out, because they're more concerned with how they're appearing when that anxiety kicks in and they're not getting a skill or a concept. And this dovetails with a second factor that contributes mightily, maybe even most profoundly, to boys' academic struggles. What few people realize, and I devoted a chapter to this in my book, as I mentioned a few minutes earlier, is that the way we talk to boys and the ways we don't talk to boys has a lasting and a profound effect on them. We teach boys to absorb gender norms and expectations before they're even old enough to speak. There's this wonderful psychologist and infant researcher that I came across early in my research, whose name is Edward Tronick. And Tronick spent the main part of his career with Harvard, and he's now at the University of Massachusetts. And he started doing research in the 1970s, where he would have a mother, it was always the mother, sitting across from the infant son or daughter. And he created this paradigm that psychologists know about. It's called the still face paradigm. And they would sit there facing each other, and what Tronick would do is he would have the mother sitting across from the infant child and then engaging. And then the researchers would gauge the responses of the infants. And then what Tronick would do is have the mothers intentionally get up, leave the room for X number of minutes, and then come back and then engage with the child. But the engagement was far more stoic. There was a lot less visual cues from the parent. There was far less talking, and there was more of a kind of stone-faced countenance. And he called this the reunion phase. He called it the reunion phase. And this is what he and his team have observed doing this in variations since the 1970s, really up through now. That when the mothers left the room, the infant boys were far more likely to cry more, to fuss more, to grow more irritable. And what I thought was most movingly was that far more than the girl infants, they would try to reach out of their high chairs and squirm to reach their mothers. When the mothers reappeared for these reunions, the emotionally wounded boys were less likely to forgive their mothers than the infant girls were. And if all of this wasn't surprising enough, later studies that Tronick and his team conducted found that during this return and repair or reunion phase, the mothers would spend more time engaging with their infant daughters than they would with their sons. And Tronick has tried to really kind of unpack a lot of that. Part of it was he has hypothesized through the decades that sometimes maybe mothers, who, are clearly exhausted, may just have an easier time interacting with their daughters who just aren't really resisting as much. But Tronick also has hypothesized that this emotional withholding is the first really message that many baby boys are receiving, that strong emotional displays will not be met with positive reinforcement. So really, it doesn't even matter why a parent is doing this. The message that it sends to the very young child is, I won't get what I need if I behave this way. It doesn't matter what the reason is for the parent, this is the message it sends to the child. The manning up of boys, Tronick wrote to me in an email, begins before they can even speak. Other research has built on Tronick's findings. A British researcher found that mothers speak with more emotionally rich language and more emotional language with their daughters. And then researchers at Emory University a few years ago conducted what I thought was just a really important study. It was really groundbreaking and seminal, in which they would attach tape recorders, small tape recorders, to fathers of toddlers. And they would also attach some kind of device where they could gauge the brain waves of the fathers as well, also when they interacted with their toddler children. And this is what they discovered. Fathers used language with their daughters, but not their sons, that spoke to emotional and bodily literacy. The language they did use with their sons spoke far more to competition and really even bordered on the idea of domination. Fathers were using words like top, best, and super. And then there were these findings that, as a parent myself of a young boy, were very difficult to read. The pleasure center, when they were gauging the brain activity in these fathers, the pleasure center in these fathers' brains lit up when their toddler daughters laughed and smiled. In terms of the sons, the pleasure center in these fathers' brains lit up when their sons betrayed neutral or stoic facial expressions. And this was another important finding. Fathers were far more likely to respond to their toddler daughters crying at night than they were their sons. There was a different study I came across that I just wanted to mention in passing as well. And this was conducted a while ago by Jennifer Engel and Nancy McElwain, who were two well-known, I believe, psychologists at the University of Illinois. And they found that when toddlers would whine or pout or had big emotional meltdowns, both mothers and fathers responded differently to daughters than they did to the sons. They were far more punitive. That was the big takeaway. They were far more punitive to the sons than they were to the daughters. So, really it's this idea that, again, it doesn't matter what the reasons are for the way parents are reacting to children. When you're the child, all that matters is the message that you're getting and what it really tells you about the way you should behave or shouldn't behave to get the strokes that you want from your parent. So it's really not surprising to hear that there was another researcher a few years ago who published a study that found that despite changing expectations for fathers, hegemonic masculine norms continue to shape their behavior. As I pored over studies for my book, I kept coming back to the same takeaway question. How could this deprivation in emotional literacy in male infants, toddlers, and boys at such crucially emotional and cognitive developmental stages, how could it not wire their brains for emotional disconnect that we see in so many older boys and even those of us as men? And then there's this. Since more and more research is finding that emotionally rich language has a huge, huge impact on cognitive, the cognitive developmental skills, and which ultimately impacts academic performance, how could this deficit not set boys back before they even start school? We should remember this. The prevailing narrative that only hypermasculine men teach boys to become men with toxic qualities really is only half-baked. Because the reality is that even many of us who consider ourselves gender enlightened unwittingly contribute to this problem as well. Again, by the ways we talk to and don't talk to boys. So when you consider the way that so many boys are raised into ascending men, it's really not surprising that this is going to really set the cast, what's that expression, whatever it is, it's not really going to really have a huge impact on their template as they approach learning and as they approach school. If you recognize students, any of the behaviors of your students in this report from Ohio State University sociologist, what they were doing was they were trying to see if there was any connection between traditional masculine norms and GPA. This is some of their findings. White boys score the highest on the scale for closely following traditional masculine norms. Math was seen as a subject that is acceptable for excelling amongst boys, and so achievement in this area could bolster or at least maintain their status amongst other males. English, reading, writing are still perceived as feminine subjects and skill sets. Showing aptitude or competence in these areas was perceived as undermining masculine status. Boys' status amongst each other rests on raw intelligence and talent, which inherently discourages any kind of openly working hard for grades. Many boys in this study perceived underperforming in school, especially feminine courses, as proof of their masculinity. And regardless of race or socioeconomics, boys who clung more to these traditional masculine norms had a considerable decline in GPA. Really, what a lot of this speaks to is that for many boys who are coming from a place of having been taught traditional masculine norms, it sends a message to them that education is really a disconfirmation of the masculinity. Now, keep in mind that there are variations on this. We're not talking in extremities here. Really, I could go around the room right now, and gauge the masculine norms that a lot of us abide by. And I can tell you right now, that even includes women as well, not just males. And I can tell you right now that this isn't, we're not talking extreme hypermasculinity. There are a lot of norms that we still adhere to that in a subconscious way really discourage this idea of boys really thinking that education is really going to be a confirmation of their masculinity in this culture. And it's far worse in the States than it is in a lot of other countries. If you look at countries, for instance, like France, there's far more parity in the education in terms of the success in a culture like France than there is here. There is less parity in England than there is in France, but it's greater there than it is here. Although this paper didn't touch on it, many of us have observed young men whose masculinity manifests and interferes in slightly different ways. There are, for instance, young men that I teach in the Honors College at Towson who are capable and very intelligent. They may earn A's and B's on big papers or tests, yet they put up this kind of passive-aggressive wall of resistance between themselves and their education. On a day-to-day basis, they're not completing smaller assignments, including homework. They often hand in assignments late. And it's almost as if they're really just showing up for the big adrenaline rush. And often it's this idea that they're trying to prove to themselves and to their other cohorts that they've got this under control and they could do the work if they feel like it. Now, even if we don't have male students like this, many of us do work with young men who don't feel that they should have to study topics or assignments that aren't going to get them ahead. That is even more common today. They expect that their education to be something that they can consume that will accelerate the pace to meet their career and monetary goals. They look at education as a straight-up transaction. And this is yet another sphere where a lot of students look at education as they do everything else as shrewd consumers. Anything that isn't going to get them closer to making that big income. By the way, that's one of the hallmarks really of contemporary masculinity is really, it's not so much the old school, walking around, pushing, less masculine men out of the way and throwing your weight around. That's really kind of more the masculinity of the past. But one of the big things today for a lot of younger men is proving yourself as a man by having lots of money. And this comes a lot from the influencers that a lot of them are consuming on YouTube. And this, of course, is getting in the way. Now, here's the thing. And this gets back, if you think back to the research that Dr. Blaylock was showing earlier, a lot of younger women have a similar perspective. That they are shrewd consumers too, every bit as much. And the difference is that they see the bigger picture. They understand that education is necessary to meeting their much larger goals and much larger ends, which is career or maybe even graduate school. They understand the necessity of showing up to class, of grinding out small assignments, of handing them in on time, having a consistent work ethic. And this is one important reason why I really do believe that a lot of women are making the smoother transition into the workplace than a lot of younger men are. A lot of college-educated men don't feel deep down that they're even up to the grinding consistency of performance that a lot of white-collar jobs really require. It may not come as a surprise, that said, to hear about the statistic of gender performance in the workplace. There was an interesting study that was done a few years ago, an Australian study, which found that employees in Australian firms were 7%, they put out 7% more effort than their male peers did. And this was a national study. And I think that this really kind of segues very much into the next topic. There's another factor that gets in the way for a lot of boys and young men, which is boredom. Now, we know that the excessive amount of time that we all spend on screens, especially on our phones, makes us more impatient and craving the stimulation that, in the case of the young men, they're getting from gaming, from social media, from watching streaming platforms such as YouTube, and even from texting. The majority of students today are bored. Nearly 80% of elementary-age students are attentive, they're curious, and they're generally optimistic about school. By the time they get to high school, that number drops to 40%. Less than a third of 11th graders feel engaged. The top 2 words students used in this study to describe their feelings about school: stressed and bored. Here's the kicker. Once again, girls are in the same boat. They feel the same way. But here's the caveat. They're not falling through the cracks because they keep their eyes on the prize. They don't lose sight of their future goals, and they work backwards, sequentially, in terms of what they need to do to reach these goals. They understand that suffering is going to have to be part of the process to get into the university they want to attend, to stay in school, to get the grades they want, to graduate, and ultimately to get the careers and the salaries that they desire. But boys aren't getting beyond this feeling of resistance that they have against embracing the idea of boredom and not getting past this. There was a great study that I came across that was done in 2021 by Viennese researchers. And what they did was they were trying to really gauge if there were any gendered learning differences during the pandemic when, where everybody was online. They found, of course, that, boys spent a lot more time on their computers and they were more engaged with their computers than their female cohorts were. No surprise. But this was surprising. On this tool that boys love spending so much time on and young men spending so much time on, that during the pandemic, when so much of education transitioned, of course, online, that the girls and young women were far more likely to keep pace with their instructors by being online, by showing up on time, by still completing all the assignments. Boys were falling through the cracks. Boys were far less consistent in their performance and their ability to even just show up to classes online. So this really just fits in with this idea that so many of the young men that we're teaching lack what I call a horizon perspective. And it's this idea that they're really having a hard time seeing beyond the immediate moment and the resistance that they're feeling to buying into this idea of playing the game that education requires. They're not really able to see this the same way that so many girls and young women are. So, part of this is neurological. We know that, we know, of course, as I was saying a few minutes ago, that the right hemisphere of the brain is impacted dramatically during puberty with the boy's ability to really see the future, into the future, and to be able to plan for their future goals. But it's also hard to overlook the old school masculinity that the Ohio State researchers were talking about, where so many boys are still buying into these ways of being in terms of their status. One of the things that I think is important to think about, and I think, it's similar and different for young men and young women, which is their online lives. One of the things that is different between young males and young females is that girls and young women are far more invested and engaged with social media. And it's not that boys and young men aren't, but the connections that boys make and maintain well into their 20s are far more intense with gaming. They do it far more with gaming than they do with social media. And then there's the important role of influencers on places like YouTube. And really what it's about is what I call information currency. It's the idea that, and again, girls experience this in young women as well, but it's different for boys, but it's all about this idea of information currency. It's that finding people that you connect with through the information, and that this gives you feelings of fulfillment and self-worth. That's an important thing that we often don't think about, the idea of the ways that online lives are fulfilling very core emotional needs for young people today. The idea of self-worth and fulfillment. We think about that in terms of the studies that have come out with social media, but in terms of boys who aren't consuming that as much, they're getting the same thing by connecting with their friends through gaming and by having the information currency through what they watch and consume on places like YouTube with influencers. So when boys whose brains are being hardwired for speed and they struggle to plan beyond the moment, when they're faced with academic courses that they can't see the value in, well, they're going to shut down. And then there's this. These challenges make them feel disconnected, and I'd even say to some extent stupid. And when boys are disconnected, they aren't able to see the purpose in their classwork at all, and they procrastinate. All of this perceived busy work just seems like a waste of time that's getting in the way of things that they'd rather be doing, that bring them faster amounts of reward and feelings of self-worth. We don't think, or we really don't even stop to even imagine, that boys' deeper emotional lives play a part in their disconnect with the learning process, but they do. There was a 2017 study that found that male students whose high school study habits proved inadequate for college coursework were far less likely to turn to advisors, parents, or staff in academic services for help. Instead, they resorted to behaviors that preserved their masculine image, such as social isolation and substance abuse, instead of asking for help. And if that wasn't devastating enough, official warnings from instructors, even from the university, which were designed to alert and to help them, ended up pushing many of these male students into further despair and disincentivized them to dig themselves out of their holes. The male students in this study appeared to lack, researchers observed, the resilience needed to recover from academic difficulties because they did not want to appear weak. At the root of such academic retreats by these males, beyond merely just blaming masculinity, is an emotional woundedness. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about the lives, the deeper emotional lives of so many boys and young men. It's not that they're necessarily aware of these things, they're not. But what they're doing is that when they get dug into a hole, by mid-semester or at some point in the semester, a lot of them, unlike a lot of their female cohorts, will not reach out for help. They feel that that is a sign of their lack of independence and in turn their weakness, that they can't handle this on their own. And so this is important for those of us who are advisors and administrators to remember this, an important study like this. This gets into this idea that I think is another influencing factor, which has to do with independence. We teach boys and men that in order to be independent, they've got to learn to handle things on their own. We perceived independence still as a manly trait. Now, of course, independence is a critical life skill, absolutely. But too often we yoke them with a message that they need to handle all of their challenges, all of their struggles on their own, even when they still need guidance. So there was a student I interviewed who was a Division I lacrosse player. His name was Jake, and he spoke directly to this. So Jake was a 23-year-old San Diego native who told me that during high school, his father pushed him to excel on the lacrosse field and in academics, which was great to hear. And Jake said, "I caught grief if I didn't score enough goals or bring home A's." He wound up as a co-captain on the Division I team he was playing for, and he graduated with honors from his university. His twin sisters, 2 years younger than Jake, excelled at lacrosse and academics as well. But they had something that Jake secretly envied, it turned out. Throughout high school, Jake sat at the desk in his bedroom, listening as their father helped his sisters in a nearby bedroom with their homework. One evening, Jake told me, he finally screwed up the courage to ask his father, "Why do you never help me with my homework?" And his father told him, "Because you're a guy. You need to learn at some point to figure out things for yourself." It reminded Jake of the way he sometimes felt when he saw his father hugging his sisters, which he didn't do with Jake. "They had something I wanted deep down, but felt like I wasn't supposed to have or ask for," Jake said. Like Jake's father, many of us want boys to grow up and be independent, of course. But here's the thing, what message do we send to boys when we tell them that they should figure out their struggles, be it in school, in friendships, in romance, sports, all by themselves? Are we really teaching them about inner strength? Are we teaching them to be really more competent as men? Because, as we've been talking about today, if you look at the many ways that girls and young women are lapping boys and young men on so many levels of education and beyond, they're outpacing boys on every metric. And they're getting encouragement, and they're being taught to ask for help along the way while they're wildly succeeding. Another factor that causes a wedge for many boys and young men is mental health struggles. Now, I don't know about any of you, of course, but I have witnessed a profound falling off amongst many of my male students. Yes, absolutely, young women are struggling with depression and anxiety. Of course they are. And they as well need help, clearly. But young men are struggling with these things just as much. And I say that because if you were to Google right now, depression differences or gender depression differences, pretty much the going line is that females experience depression at 2 to 1. So I'll get back to that in a minute, but keep that in mind that these rates are far closer than we thought that they were. So let's talk for just a minute in general terms. Nearly 1 in 4 high school and college-age students are reporting depression, and 1 in 5 are reporting anxiety, and that's up at least 20% since the pandemic began. We all know that this is perhaps the most chronically stressed generation in the modern era, and it's not surprising that suicide, sadly, is the second leading cause of death amongst individuals between the ages of 10 and 34. The age 10 was something that was added on a few years ago because researchers are seeing more children as young as 10 committing suicide. Boys and young men in the ages of 15 to 24 are 3 times more likely than their female cohorts to commit suicide, and that's a global number, by the way. Clearly, there's an the emotional disconnect and isolation, which is a public health crisis among young and older men, is behind this problem. Depression is, of course, behind this problem as well. More and more research is showing that the gap that I was talking a moment ago about between males and females with depression is actually a lot narrower than they realized initially. So one of the things that many healthcare practitioners, and this includes mental health care providers, typically do when they gauge depression is they'll look at symptoms that most often manifest in females. They'll look at things like crying, lack of appetite, ennui, lethargy, and those symptoms can manifest in boys and young men. But a lot of the symptoms that are more common in boys and young men get overlooked. So you're talking about things like risky behavior, far riskier behavior. And things like spending a lot more time in the gym or at a job. These are things that always get overlooked. You're looking, of course, at substance abuse. You're looking at struggling to stay focused in class or at work. So there are these behaviors that often get overlooked, and it's one of the reasons. The storyline is that, and it's true, that a lot of males resist getting mental health help because they feel like it makes them appear weak. That is true. But depression and anxiety are often grossly mis- and underdiagnosed by many healthcare and healthcare practitioners. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, the DSM, which is the Bible for mental health care practitioners for symptoms, for treatment, the DSM at this time does not include symptoms that more commonly manifest in males for depression. It still includes symptoms that many healthcare practitioners are using that are more commonly showing up in females. Last year, 50% of the male students that I taught in freshman survey courses dropped out of sight by midterms. I've seen this trend getting worse and worse the past few semesters. Many of them I learned are struggling with crippling depression and anxiety. And there's one other factor that I want to talk about that I think is not nearly as much of a profound factor, but I think it is an increasingly influencing factor for some young men, which is that for some of them, colleges don't always feel like welcoming places. Now, I am sure some of you are chafing at this statement, right? After all, many of these young men are the scions of privilege, and it's true that all young men can benefit from learning greater empathy and awareness of the experiences of people who don't enjoy the same privileges. And I've always said that, I've always written that, I always will. When I say that many schools are not welcoming places for young men, I'm not talking about the young white men who believe that they're being discriminated against in college applications. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the tenor in many classrooms in schools, as early as middle school, that have become gender politicized spaces where boys are sent messages that being male, just simply being male, is problematic at best and sometimes toxic at worst. A middle schooler that I interviewed for my book, his name was Harrison. He's probably in high school by now. He'd shared with me how one day when I spoke to him, he was very upset because the teacher, his English teacher in class that day, had asked the class to write about a poem that they had read in which a black poet was talking about suffering. And Harrison said that he identified with the poem, and he shared this with the teacher when she'd asked for class responses. So he was hurt and confused when the teacher told him, well, what do you know about suffering? You're a white male. Now, clearly, sending such messages aren't productive, nor do they create learning spaces that feel safe. One of the most memorable boys that I interviewed for my book was also a then middle schooler named Nico. He was a 13-year-old boy. He was preternaturally articulate. He was very thoughtful and empathetic. And he was part of a boys group at the school that he attended at the time, where they got together for lunch once a week, and they would just debate and discuss what a new brand of masculinity would look like. And the last time I interviewed him, he said something that stayed with me. He described how many girls at his school walked through the hallways wearing T-shirts with messages such as "the future is female," and it was a message that the boys felt was already very present. They spoke of teachers actually telling them that, well, of course, as Harrison said, that boys have a lot of privileges that that girls never will or don't. It also reminded me of when I was doing research that there's a lot of support out there. When you look at book titles for books and on social media, there's a lot of wonderful resources out there for empowering girls, as I believe as there should be. But when you look at these things and you look at them comparatively, there's far, far less for boys. And one of the things that Nico said to me was, I've always supported and I've been taught to support feminism and Me Too, and I definitely do. And he said, but it feels like boys are being sidelined because we're, well, boys. And then he paused and he said, and I keep wondering, where am I in there? he said, where do I fit into this future? And I think there's validity to this kind of unease and feelings of feeling untethered. I mentioned about looking, at book titles and looking at memes and social media. One of the things I've written about, I did a piece for the Post on this, is the idea that if you look online alone at places where there is affection, fathers showing affection to children, the vast amount of this is going to be fathers showing this to daughters, which is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing. But the nurturing and the affection that fathers are showing to daughters, you won't find that as much for sons. And, how can that not send a message to boys who are seeing these kind of things online? The takeaway here is not that we shouldn't keep supporting girls. Of course we should, girls and young women. But we should also do a better job of supporting boys, of teaching them and encouraging them to feel more connected, to feel that the future belongs to them as well. Because we send a clear message that an entire segment, when we send this message that an entire segment of the population is no longer relevant, how can that not create some kind of deep inner wound and disconnect? How can that not feel like a wholesale rejection of one's identity for simply being who they are? At a time when boys are increasingly lacking emotional resilience, when depression, despair, isolation, and suicide rates are increasing, withholding support and creating a cultural ethos around this deficit sends an unspoken but powerful message. It teaches boys that they don't need and that they aren't worthy of our support. Really, on a deeper level, this was what Nico was asking. What does the future hold for me and for other boys in a world where we increasingly feel unworthy and disconnected? Now, if you're scoffing at this statement right about now, consider this. When we wholly discount another person's very real experiences and emotional reactions to them, we lose our capacity for empathy and we start veering into dehumanization. If we learned anything from the debacle down at Johns Hopkins University, where this supposedly progressive anti-Semitic teaching assistant considered failing students because they were pro-Israel white boys, really, what does that say about us as educators if our tolerance and empathy is overtly selective, based solely on someone's identity or politics? The disconnect that Nico and Harrison experienced gets even more pervasive as boys get older. Many of the young men I teach have shared in informal surveys that they don't feel safe being part of class conversations because they fear saying something that might be construed as offensive, especially to their female classmates. So they essentially shut down during class discussions. And more disturbingly, they feel disconnected from the entire class itself. Young women don't have as much that concern. They worry about social perfection, to be sure. But they're far more comfortable with taking risks, with discussing ideas that are gender-related, because, as one of them observed, we're on the right side of the conversation. So here's a great example of this disconnect that many young men are feeling. Many semesters in the honors course I teach, The Changing Face of Masculinity, it starts out with 4 or 5 young men. The rest of the class is always made up of young women. And after the first class or two, when we start discussing and deconstructing traditional masculinity, the number of male students drops down to 1 or 2 every semester. When I asked one of these young men who I had taught before, so there was some kind of connection there, why he dropped the class, he told me, I just can't handle having the whole male bashing thing thrown in my face in yet another class, let alone in every single class. So what can we do to keep male students in our classes and keep them engaged in the learning process? On a micro level, we can create learning spaces where our overt political dispositions are tempered just a little bit more, and where we set ground rules early in the semester with students that encourage respect, tolerance, and empathy for everyone during discussions. And this can't be a one-off conversation. It's something that's got to be ongoing. We've got to remind our students that it's got to be a safe place for civil conversation, respectful conversation for everyone. One of the things that often happens later in the semester, and I'm sure some of you have had the same experience, I said earlier that a lot of the male students stop really getting involved in conversations. Sometimes it might be helpful to actually call in some of the male students, and to just ask them to get, to just say, what are your thoughts or feelings on the topic that we're discussing about this? Because it's crucial to remember, we don't have to agree with them. We just want to keep them engaged, to have buy-in into our classes. Because remember that, when boys and young men feel emotionally disconnected, they aren't trying harder. They don't say to themselves, I'm going to dig in and I'm going to do better. They pull away, as that study showed. One of the things that I've started doing is I email students who miss 2 classes in a row just to make sure that they're okay. One of the reasons I do this, well, 2 reasons I do it. A is, of course, because I do want to make sure they're okay, and B, because I want them to know that I care. It's as simple as that. Something as simple as that sends a message to any student, regardless of who they are, that this professor really cares about me as a person. So that small little gesture can actually go a long way with starting to create relationship. Encourage your male students to get help at the Wellness Center if they seem depressed, anxious, or overly stressed. One of the things that I'm going to be talking to somebody at the Wellness Center at my school is about starting to create at the Wellness Center spaces where young men can kind of have conversations about things that can be academically related, but also could be about the struggles they're having in other parts of their lives as well. Basically, the equivalent of like a men's circle or a men's group. I think that the other thing I wanted to mention is about advising. Research shows that advising techniques that work with female students when they're academically distressed aren't working with male students. And this harkens back to that earlier study I mentioned. It's, when a lot of female students receive word from an instructor or the university that they're struggling or they're failing, they're more likely to come and ask for help. What can I do? And that, of course, creates an open door for us to partner with them. As that study showed, and I think anecdotally a lot of us can speak to this, a lot of male students don't do that. They disappear. They hunker down and they self-isolate. And so as advisors, we can really be the first line of offense for them in terms of making sure that we are having conversations with male students where, chastising them, telling them they've got to buckle down, work harder. A lot of these things aren't working with young men today. A lot of this makes them feel worse about themselves, and they're not reacting the way that, say, many of us would have 20 or 30 years ago. They're not reacting that way. And so it's those kinds of approaches simply just don't hit pay dirt anymore. I think that it's really important for those of us as advisors or even as instructors that we're trying to be a little bit more in relationship with male students, to let them know that we really do care, that we don't even have to tell them we care if we don't feel comfortable doing that. But it's about just creating situations like emailing them and saying that they're okay, that show that we're invested in who they are as people, not just as students. And I think that it's important to remind boys that there's nothing wrong with asking for help. That if they're confused or they're frustrated or maybe even a little bit scared, it's completely normal. But it's important to ask for help. And that is something that a lot of boys and even men don't feel they have. Permission to ask for help. So it's important that we realize that and know that at the outset, because a lot of boys think that it's betraying weakness if they come and they ask for help. And not something a lot of them will do. It means that the onus is on us to reach out and to let them know it's okay to ask for help. And I'm here if you want it. Just please know that. As simple as that.